Bordeaux is by far one of the most infamous wine regions in the world, but with over 65 appellations and dozens of permitted grape varieties, it can also feel very complicated and overwhelming for the average wine consumer. Hi, friends, my name is Sarah, and I'm a certified sommelier and host of the Wine CEO podcast show. And this week, I am bringing you my Bordeaux 101 episode. So, today is going to be a brief overview of everything you need to know about the Bordeaux wine region if you don't know anything about it, or if you're looking to dive into this region more and learn about the amazing wines coming out of Bordeaux, France. If you missed last week's episode, I did a quick overview of my tips and tricks for traveling to the Bordeaux region, and I have two more episodes coming your way about Bordeaux, where I got to interview winemakers and wine industry professionals while I was visiting the region this summer. So if you haven't subscribed to my show, click subscribe now so you don't miss any of the upcoming content, and let's dive into my 101 episode on Bordeaux. Now, the vineyard area in Bordeaux is the second largest in France. It's actually just behind the Languedoc-Roussillon, and it has over 100,000 hectares under vine. So it's a massive region. Bordeaux is actually larger than all of the German wine regions combined. It's 6 times larger than Napa Valley. It's made up of 65 appellations, and believe it or not, there are over 5,000 grape growers here, helping to make more than 500 million bottles of wine every year. Now, for comparison, Champagne makes around 300 million bottles of wine and Burgundy makes around 200 million bottles of wine. So Bordeaux is definitely making a massive amount of wine for the region and is well known as one of the top regions within France and within the world. Now, 85% of the wines produced in Bordeaux are red. So while there are some amazing white and even sweet wines that are produced in this region, the majority coming out of the region is red, and so that's really what the region is known for. We'll talk a little bit later in today's episode about the specific grape varieties that are used, but know that when you think Bordeaux, you should definitely think red wine. Bordeaux has a maritime climate. It's about 1 hour from the Atlantic Ocean, and it has the Gironde estuary that connects the ocean to the two main rivers that are cutting through the Bordeaux region, the Dordogne and the Garonne. And these were used to transport wine and goods around Europe for years by the English and Dutch. In fact, the Dutch were actually the ones who first drained the left bank of the estuary, revealing large gravel banks. And this has given the land the ability to have perfect drainage needed for growing grapes for many, many decades. And unlike a lot of other regions that might be known for one or two specific grape varieties, like we think of Burgundy and we immediately think of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, Bordeaux is known for blends, so both red blends as well as white blends. So there are 20 permitted red and white grapes in the Bordeaux region, and the winemakers will use them to create really well-balanced and age-worthy white and red wines. Now, when we're talking about regions of Bordeaux, there are really two main regions that are most often spoken about, and that's the left bank and the right bank. So the left bank refers to the region that is just south of the Gironde estuary, and the right refers to the vineyards that are north of the estuary. Now, right at the end of the estuary, in the middle to the southeast of the right and the left bank, are Graves and Entre du Mer. And these are two smaller regions that are really known almost exclusively for making white and sweet wine. Now, within these main regions that I just mentioned, the left and right bank, Entre du Mer and Graves, there are over 65 appellations. And so this makes Bordeaux a rather complicated region to understand because not only are there so many regions to discuss, all of these smaller communes across Bordeaux that you have to learn about, but there's also a lot of really unique regional history that we'll talk about in a minute. And each commune has some very different laws and restrictions around how wine is produced and what can be made in order to bear the name of that commune. And so it's very inconsistent from one region to the next within Bordeaux. So as you can imagine, this is a little annoying for those of us in the wine industry that have to study all of those different aspects because it makes it really difficult to master Bordeaux. So it is a complicated region. So the first thing I want you to understand is this is a complicated region. Don't don't panic if you feel like it's going to take you some time to really get a grasp on Bordeaux, because it does for all of us. It's definitely a more complicated region to understand when you're getting into it. And so the best thing to do is to take it one day at a time, absorb what little bit of knowledge you can each day, and then drink Bordeaux wine and make sure you're exploring different communes and different regions so you can learn more about everything that Bordeaux has to offer. So I mentioned just a moment ago how each of the various appellations or communes has different laws around the wine production. And so, for example, you could see a wine from Bordeaux that's labeled Premier Cru Classe, and that might mean one thing in one commune, but something very different in another commune. And so this makes it very difficult because following the restrictions around classification can be very challenging. So one of the biggest things to know, though, is that while in Champagne and Burgundy and a lot of other regions of France, the classifications are done based on vineyard, so the specific land and the terroir. In Bordeaux, classifications are done based on the chateau or the estate, the house, the winemaker. So a lot of people argue that because of this, there isn't as much of a focus on terroir and the importance of that region within Bordeaux. It's more so a focus on the reputation of the winemaker. But I think we could also all argue that the winemaker plays a huge part in the finished product, right? In what the wine is going to taste like. And so because of that, a winemaker with a great reputation is making great wine. And so maybe that should be considered a little bit higher. I think too, what we'll talk about in a second is how one of the original classifications of the Bordeaux region was based on what was considered the premier wineries located in the premier land. And so that has created a structure where those initial wineries received this higher classification and this prestige for a reason. But it's good to know at least that it is a bit of a debate. And so some of the world's top quality wines are coming from Bordeaux. And so you know that the wines are phenomenal. But it's interesting to just note that a lot of these classifications are done based on the name of the chateau, the history of that chateau, and the wines that have historically been produced by that chateau, and not necessarily by the region where the wine comes from. So again, in Burgundy, you would know that there's a particular AOC or region of origin where wine comes from, and there might be 3 or 4 wineries within that region of origin. And so all of those wineries, because their grapes are located in that region, the wines made from those grapes would then receive that same classification. Whereas in Bordeaux, you could have 3 or 4 wineries that are all located in the exact same appellation, in the exact same place of origin, but one winery might have a higher classification than another, again, just because of the history and heritage of one winery compared to another. So it's not necessarily based on where the grapes are located in Bordeaux, but more so on the winery. Okay, so we aren't going to dive too deep into this world of classifications because I could probably do an entire episode on it and it would be very long, and I've already chatted about it quite a bit. But there's one more thing that I have to mention because I would be remiss to do a Bordeaux 101 episode and not talk about the Bordeaux classification of 1855, because this is probably the most important fact that you need to know about Bordeaux. When you're learning more about the wine industry, you will hear about the 1855 classification many, many times. So it's very important to understand that this historic event happened in Bordeaux. So in 1855, Napoleon III created the Paris Universal Exposition. So this was basically the Paris World's Fair. And it was this large show in the Champs-Élysées in Paris that attracted over 5 million people to view inventions, art, and agricultural wonders from around France. So Napoleon wanted to compete with the London exhibition of 1851, and so everything had to be the absolute best. So the planning committee for the exposition reached out to the Bordeaux Chamber of Commerce to provide the best wines from Bordeaux for the fair. So I'm not going to go into all of the nitty-gritty details here, but basically the chamber worked with some local wine brokers to classify wineries into growths or categories. There were 5 categories. So what the wine brokers were looking for were which chateaus were commanding the highest rates in the wine market. Those that were able to charge the most for their wines because of the reputation and what folks considered to be the best wines of Bordeaux because they were paying really high prices for them. These were considered first growths or premier crus. The next step down was then the second growth, and so on through 5 different levels. So there were 61 chateaus that were classified in all, and there were 4 of them that reached this status of Premier Cru, or First Growth. So this was Chateau Margaux, Chateau Haut-Brion, Chateau Lafite Rothschild, and Chateau Latour. Now later, the Rothschild family actually contested the results, and they were able to lobby to have their family's winery reclassified from a second growth to a first growth. And so Chateau Mouton Rothschild is considered the fifth and final Bordeaux first growth. Now, other than this one change that happened in 1973, there have been no other changes to the 61 Chateau rankings since 1855. And this brings us back to the question that I posed a moment ago around the notoriety of the chateau versus terroir and winemaker expression. So because these rankings haven't changed at all from year to year based on performance of the wine in a blind tasting or really any matter at all, they are forever classified into this ranking that they were placed in of first, second, third, fourth, or fifth growth. So as you can imagine, this definitely brings up quite the debate in the wine industry. Now, there are definitely some wine merchants and wine raters that have still given their own opinions on current vintages, and they'll pit one winery against another and talk about how maybe a fourth growth is really excellent and should be considered at the same level as a second growth, etc. But all in all, the prestige of the classified chateaus really has remained unchanged since 1855. And first, I should mention that that's not to say that these wines are not excellent. They're all incredible. There's a reason why they were demanding a high price at the time. Their wines were being made from grapes that were coming from phenomenal regions within Bordeaux. So the terroir really did play into that. And then obviously the winemakers were making exceptional wines. These wineries wanted to continue this incredible legacy. And so they have hired the best teams. They continue to produce some of the best wines. And so they continue to gain incredible notoriety in the industry. And they have still the ability to get an incredible price point for a lot of these wines because they are phenomenal. They really are amazing. But a lot of people argue if they're really worth the price that they're getting, or if a lot of that comes from the marketing of the name because they're known as a first growth, a second growth, etc. So kind of a fun debate to have and something to really be aware of. Obviously, these wineries would not be able to keep up the heritage of their name if they just stopped making great wines tomorrow. So they really are making phenomenal wines. But what the classification system also does is it leaves out some amazing wineries that have been making excellent wine for years, either because maybe they were ranked as a fourth or fifth growth, and so folks don't consider them to be on par as some of the first, second, and third growths, or they might not be ranked at all. Maybe they weren't one of the original 61 chateaus that were ranked, and so they aren't ranked in the 1855 classification, but they're making some phenomenal wines. And so what this means is that there are some excellent Bordeaux wines that can be found at a rather reasonable price point if you know where to look. So hopefully that tells you a little bit about the 1855 classification. Again, there's so much more we could talk about when it comes to this specific classification, as well as classifications in general in Bordeaux. If you want to dive a little bit deeper into this topic, I cannot recommend enough The Wine Bible by Karen McNeil. This is a phenomenal resource, whether you're studying for an exam or you just want to learn more in the wine industry, you just are an enthusiast. This is a book that every wine lover needs to have. It is phenomenal. She does an amazing job of giving you some additional detail in a really digestible way. I think I've owned like 2 or 3 editions of this book because it's just been a phenomenal resource for years. She just came out with a recent edition a few months ago and it's in color, it's been updated. And as soon as I bought it, like the day it was released, I think I like read it immediately cover to cover. And I've done it again multiple times since because it's a phenomenal resource and has some great info in there. So if you don't own it, definitely go check it out. It is amazing. Now let's transition to talk a little bit more about the wine region specifically. So again, I mentioned the 2 main regions that we're talking about when we usually talk about Bordeaux are the left and right bank. And so let's break that down a little bit more. So first up, we have the Medoc and the Haut-Medoc. So these 2 regions technically make up what we would call the Medoc, and they are on the left bank of Bordeaux. So remember, they're south of the Gironde estuary between the city of Bordeaux and the Atlantic coast. And in the Haut-Medoc, which is a little bit closer to Bordeaux city, you have the famous villages of Pauillac, Saint-Estèphe, Margaux, and Saint Julien. Now, believe it or not, almost all of the 61 rated wineries in the 1855 classification are found within the Haut-Medoc. So this was definitely considered the best region for growing grapes within Bordeaux at the time, and it continues to have incredible notoriety to this day. Now, I'm not going to go through each of the communes because that would take us obviously forever. But the biggest thing to know is that the left bank is really known for Cabernet Sauvignon heavy blends. And we haven't talked about grape varieties yet, so let me dive into that a little bit for a second. So Bordeaux is known for red wines, red blends, as I mentioned earlier, and there are really 5 main grapes that have historically been the main red grapes here within Bordeaux, making up the blends. So often these varieties are called Bordeaux varieties or the noble grapes of Bordeaux. And these are Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Malbec, and Petit Verdot. And they all hold very special significance in the region. Sometimes folks will often add Carmenere to this list as a 6th variety that's planted in small amounts throughout the region. But these are the main grapes to know about when we're talking about Bordeaux. Now, the winemakers don't have to use all of these grapes in their blend. And in fact, there are actually a few more grape varieties that are permitted technically in the region. And so winemakers definitely have a lot of creativity here. You will find some single varietal wines that are in the region, but historically, again, the region makes mostly blends. And so you might find that there's one producer that's going to make something that is predominantly Cabernet Sauvignon with just a little bit of Merlot and a little bit of Petit Verdot blended in it. You might find one that has mostly Cabernet Sauvignon with a little bit of Carmenere blended into it, right? So it just is really up to the winemaker and their preference of how they want to express their wine. But the biggest thing to remember about the left bank is that the red blends often produced here are going to be predominantly Cabernet Sauvignon. And I'll tell you why in just a second when we talk about the terroir. But it's easy to compare the two sides of the bank so that you can kind of like in your mind separate the importance of the wines coming from the region. So the right bank, on the other hand, has historically produced red blends that are predominantly Merlot. So the 2 main communes to know about on the right bank are Saint-Emilion and Pomerol. Saint-Emilion is this adorable medieval town. It has this gorgeous 12th century underground church at the center. The vineyards that surround the city scale these like beautiful nearby hills, and the residents are so proud of their solely red wines that are produced in the area, again, mostly from Merlot. So if you missed my episode last week, again, go check it out because I visited Saint-Emilion and it is just the cutest town. So if you're planning a trip to the region, you have to check it out. Now, Pomerol, on the other hand, is a very, very small village that's just north of Saint-Emilion on the right bank, and the vineyards here are much smaller as well. Pomerol was otherwise completely obscure for many, many years because the right bank was not as accessible to merchants as the left bank. So remember, the Dutch had made the left bank a little more accessible by draining some of the Gironde estuary, but the right bank was still not quite as accessible. There weren't as many roads or docks, and so wines coming from that region were not as well known for a very long time. And none of the wineries on this side were included in the 1855 classification. But there was a keen businessman that invested in a very special winery in the 1960s. And in the following years, Chateau Petrus became a cult wine in the industry. It was sold as this wine that was amazing and better than a lot of the left bank Bordeaux wineries, and people started rallying behind Chateau Petrus, saying that this was truly the best wine in the world, and it created quite a bit of attention for the Pomerol region, and it helped the other wineries in Pomerol become rather acclaimed as well. Now, Chateau Petrus continues to be one of the most expensive wines in the world today. An average bottle of Chateau Petrus could range anywhere from $5,000 to $25,000 or even more, depending on how rare and special a vintage is. So it really is still a cult wine, very expensive to this day. And a lot of folks consider it to be one of the best wines in the world. Now, I've never had the great opportunity to try this wine because of the price point, but what I hear is that it really is amazing. Now, Graves is the region south of the Medoc and south of Bordeaux City, and it's kind of in the center of the left and right bank. It's known for producing both red and white wines. The reds are typically a blend of a lot of these major Bordeaux grape varieties that I've already mentioned, and then the whites are typically Sauvignon Blanc or Semillon, or a blend of the two. Now, the region is especially known for the communes of Sauternes and Barsac that make sweet wine. So the sweet wines are typically made from Semillon, and they're actually made in a very famous, but I will admit, unappetizing way. So the grapes are affected with botrytis, which is a fungus that is often called the noble rot in the wine industry. And it's called the noble rot because this fungus actually helps the grapes to decay to a perfect level of rottenness, I know, but it results in these perfectly concentrated juices that have really high sugar content content and rounded flavors that can be made into this really supple, sweet wine. And since the grape bunches are all rotted, they have to be delicately hand harvested and often picked berry by berry to ensure that only the best berries that have been fully affected are used to make the wine. And so when these grapes are pressed, sometimes they will often look like raisins, and they will be pressed and a syrupy, really thick kind of juice will come out of the grape, and then that is converted into wine. Now, because these grapes are so highly concentrated, this sugary syrup that some would say can't even really pass for grape juice, it can actually be converted to 14% alcohol by volume while still reserving a really high 10 to 15% level of residual sugar. So these wines are very sweet, very, very flavorful, and they are an exception to the rule where we would typically say that in higher alcohol by volume means a lower level of sugar content because the wine, the fermentation has been eating all of the sugar in order to produce alcohol. That's not the case with Sauternes and these sweet wines coming from Barsac because there's so much sugar content in the grape juice already that even though they can get a really high alcohol by volume, there's still plenty of sugar left over. So really sweet wines, but really well developed and phenomenal flavor. So that's really what the Graves region is known for. And then the last region that I want to mention is Entre-deux-Mers. So Entre-deux-Mers is the region between the Garonne and Durand rivers. It's coming out of the Gironde estuary, and this region makes almost exclusively white wines from Sauvignon Blanc, sometimes with a little bit of Semillon blended in as well. So these are kind of considered the white table wines of Bordeaux. There's definitely some unique wines that are being made there, and folks are starting to get a little more attention to this region, but historically it's been considered more of a minor region within Bordeaux. So as you can tell, when we are talking about Bordeaux, we really focus mostly on the left and right banks. Both are making red blends with very similar grapes, but in different makeup, right? So the difference comes down to the soil. And I alluded to this earlier, but in the left bank, you have all of this limestone and gravel, and the right bank has a little more clay influence. And so that clay is going to absorb moisture and regulate temperature throughout the year, whereas the gravel and limestone is going to reflect the sunlight to help mature the grapes, and there's less clay on the left bank and less moisture. So Cabernet Sauvignon loves this environment. It loves that extra heat that it's getting from the sun. These grapes really develop strong fruit flavors, and so you're gonna get these really like ripe fruit, chewy, tannin kind of structured grapes coming out of the left bank. So it's absolutely perfect for growing Cabernet Sauvignon. Whereas on the right bank, Merlot thrives with the clay soil and this terroir that gives it a little extra moisture, not as much heat and direct sunlight throughout the day. So because of this, what you can notice is that the wineries are making the blends they're making for a reason. So the left bank is really heavy on your Cabernet Sauvignon blends because Cabernet Sauvignon thrives on the left bank. And the right bank is making Merlot heavy blends because Merlot thrives in the climate and the terroir of the right bank. So what a lot of folks will tell you is that the left bank is more well known around the world, probably because of the 1855 classification and some of the prestige coming from that region, that it's more known by consumers and could be considered a little more famous, maybe some would even argue better wines. But I think that both banks really hold their treasures. Both banks have incredible wines that are being made. Both of them have amazing wineries with incredible history. So basically your homework from this is you need to try a lot of wines from Bordeaux. You have to try wines from the left bank next to the right bank. You have to try multiple wines from within the same bank, but from different communes. I think this is the best way to find your favorite regional wines within Bordeaux. And let me tell you, no matter where you go within Bordeaux, you will find outstanding wines. So whether it's left bank or right bank, you are not going to be disappointed. Now I want to mention one last thing today that is fairly unique to the Bordeaux region as well. And I alluded to it in my last episode when I was talking about one of the largest wine events of the year that's hosted in Bordeaux each April. And in the industry, this is called En Primeur. And this is when some of the most expensive wines of Bordeaux are sold as futures or futures. And basically wine shippers will taste wines and decide if they want to secure a future allotment, basically. So when the winery is ready to let these wines depart, typically 2, 3, 4, 5 years later after they've received some aging, the shipper or negociant will then receive the wine that they've purchased. So basically they're choosing to purchase an allotment that will be available in the future, so they won't receive that shipment for a few years, but they're buying future wine that hasn't been bottled yet. So they're hoping that this wine will be worth a lot of money in the future, and they're hoping that by tasting it, they can recognize that this will be a really excellent wine as it ages. So these are often very prestigious wines that are going to sell out to only select distributors long before the wine's been made in bottle, which is kind of crazy to think about. It's a really unique process. It's been in Bordeaux for decades, and what this means is that it can sometimes be more difficult for consumers to find some really prestigious wines from Bordeaux because they're going to be sold in futures before they would ever even be available to a consumer. And so only certain select distributors will be able to get access to these wines and then choose which restaurants and stores around the world will then be able to receive those wines. So kind of another interesting fun fact about Bordeaux and something special to know. All right, so I think I've thrown a lot at you, but hopefully I focused on the main things that you really want to take away from Bordeaux. We could spend weeks going over a lot more details around this region that has some incredible history, and there will definitely be opportunity for more episodes about the unique terroir, the infamous wineries, hidden bargains to find, and so much more. But for today, I think this was a great high-level overview, and we can save all of those other topics for a future day. If you learned something today and you loved this episode, don't forget to like and share it with a friend. If you haven't subscribed to the show yet, please do so now. I would also love if you could give me a quick comment below here on YouTube, or if you're listening, give me a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It's a great way for new listeners to be able to find the show. Until next week, friends, I hope you drink something new and delicious, and I will catch you all in the next episode of the Wine CEO Podcast.